Hi again, everyone. This is Dr. Olena. We just had a brief technical snafu there a few seconds ago. So if you were on here earlier, we suddenly dropped and disappeared. And so who knows? So hopefully cross fingers and the tech gods will be with us over the next 10 minutes. So if you missed the first part, so here I am again. I'm Dr. Olena Gill. I'm a naturopathic physician practicing in beautiful Parksville or Oceanside, British Columbia, and now also on Gabriola Island on British Columbia, and that's all on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. And so today I actually really want to talk to you all about something that every single person on the planet goes through, and that is a little something called stress. And you know, and so when I talk to patients and people who come into my office, and my question is, you know, do you experience stress? Well, everybody experiences stress. The question is, to what degree are you experiencing stress? You know, what are your stressors? How are you responding to stress? And so all those things really vary from person to person. And so the important piece of all this is that stress is connected with a little gland called the adrenal glands. And we all have these two little adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. And they're located about the mid-back. And they literally sit on top of the kidneys, and they pump out a hormone. And this hormone is called cortisol. It pumps out a few other things, but cortisol hormone is actually one of the primary things that, or one of the big things, I should say, that the adrenal gland pumps out. And cortisol actually is what helps regulate our stress. Now, cortisol actually gets pumped out regularly throughout the day. So in other words, it constantly monitors how our bodies respond to daily stressors, whether they're large or small or medium or anywhere in between, but it's a constant, essentially a pulsation of this cortisol hormone. Now, why that is important is again coming back to the level of stress that we experience in our lives. And so there are essentially three different stages of adrenal stress. Is what I call them, three different stages. The first stage is something called like an alarm stage. In other words, you're experiencing something really acutely in your life. Like, let's say you're walking in the forest and you're going on your merry way, and suddenly you round a corner and you encounter a bear. Okay, so that's a very sudden stress that happens out of the blue that you weren't expecting, you weren't planning for it, but it just suddenly happens. And so your body goes into, this protective mode, and it responds rather very, very suddenly. So in case of the bear, your heart starts racing, your face may get flushed, your body may get paralyzed, or you may just turn around suddenly and try to get away as quickly as possible. So that's what's called an alarm response or an alarm stage. The next stage is something that's a little more chronic, and it occurs probably to most of us pretty much on a daily basis. And so in this stage, I usually, I'd say I'd probably put 99% of us in this category, is that we deal with very low levels of chronic stress on a daily basis. In other words, the things that we fight off every day, whether it's traffic on the highway, whether it's a job that's under stress, let's say you're under pressure by your employer, or the demands of just the job in general every day, or it can be relationship or emotional stressors. And so I'd say a large chunk of us really just fall into this category, where we have these continual low-lying stressors that are constantly happening, and they never really give up or they get resolved. So during this stage, cortisol still continues to get pumped out, but now it actually starts to approach a more, I was gonna say it's a chronic stage, but it's like gas in the car. You know, you go along and you know you need the gas to drive, but eventually that gas gets down close to the red line, if you will, and maybe you might have trouble finding a gas station to fill up, and so this is where we tend to fall into this crack here. This can translate to things like sleeping issues, you know, where we go to bed and maybe we wake up 2-3 hours later, or maybe we'll just go in these cycles of we'll go to sleep and we'll wake up, we go to sleep, we wake up, etc. Or we wake up in the morning and we're not refreshed, or we may really have slept through a large number of hours. Maybe we had 8, 9, even 10 hours, let's say, of sleep, but we wake up in the morning and we're still really tired and we're still really draggy. Or at points during the day where we need a pick-me-up. Let's say during the day, mid-morning, mid-afternoon, we go grab our caffeinated beverage to get us through the rest of the day. Now, those are situations where now we run into that chronic stage of coping with our stressors. Finally, the third stage is now we're getting into exhaustion. Now we're feeling fatigued all the time. We're just dragging ourselves everywhere, no matter what we do. And this is where, again, the analogy of the car and the fuel, I liken it to, well, now our fuel has run dry. And in other words, we're driving on fumes. We're driving, but we're running on fumes. We need to figure out how to keep filling up our tank. And the reality is, in this situation, our resources for making the fuel that we need to fill up our tank are now also in jeopardy or are exhausted. So in other words, we don't have a really good supportive base to create what the body needs in order to deal with the stressors at hand. So I'd say, like I said, most people often fall into the second category, but there's definitely some that are usually often in that third stage where we're so fatigued. And there is a term out there that it's still a little controversial, but it gets floated around a lot, and it's called adrenal fatigue. And the reality is not everybody has adrenal fatigue or adrenal exhaustion. It really does depend on how your cortisol levels are running. And the only way to really figure out where you're at, whether you're truly fatigued or truly exhausted, is by actually measuring it. And so that brings me to my next thing. It goes, well, why should I actually get tested for my cortisol hormone? Well, a number of the reasons why what I've already kind of set out a few minutes ago, those are actually all good reasons. You come in and you're fatigued all the time. You're dragging yourself throughout the day. You need some sort of stimulants to get you through parts of your day, to get through the work day, or etc. You have some sleeping issues. You go to bed, you wake up. You go to bed, you wake up, that sort of thing. Or you wake up in the morning and you're not feeling like you've just had a good night's rest. Those are actually all indicators that there's something going on, there's something amiss with the cortisol levels. And so one of the ways to test to see where your levels are at is to run what we call a saliva cortisol panel. Now, I do this actually quite a bit in the office. And so one most common way is to simply test your saliva. And what happens is, it's actually a really simple test to do. And I'll just show you this. So basically, we actually in a sense do 4 tests. And we test your cortisol, in fact, throughout different points of the day, starting with the morning cortisol. In other words, cortisol that gets measured as soon as you wake up, and then again about mid-morning, again about just before dinner time or late afternoon, and then finally just before bedtime. And so then these measurements are like plotted out on a graph. And they can tell us completely different things as to, first of all, what stage you're at. If you just note the 3 stages that I talked about earlier, this can actually help us determine what stage you're at. And also how your cortisol is functioning. Do you have enough resources within you to keep producing the cortisol hormone? Do you need a better support system? That sort of thing. So when we look at these 4 different points throughout the day, we can actually then determine what is it that you specifically need in order to improve the health of your cortisol output. So I'll show you this little test actually. So the test is done through a saliva sample. So in other words, you just spit in a little test tube and it looks a little something just like this, with a little green cap. And you get 4 of these in your test kit, which you take home, and then you do over this essentially about a 12-hour period, approximately. So you spit in the test tube and 4 times a day, and essentially then you take it home, you do it, and then it gets shipped off to the lab, and then we can actually figure out exactly where your cortisol levels are at. And you come back with, the test comes back with a lovely little picture of these 4 points on a graph, and you get to see a lovely little picture of where your cortisol lands on this graph. And so when we measure cortisol, for example, in the morning, that's actually very important because that tells us how much cortisol you're producing overnight. So in other words, when you spit in the test tube first thing in the morning, it actually allows us to see how healthy your cortisol production was while you were sleeping. At nighttime, let's say the fourth little saliva sample that you do right at bedtime, that actually is able to tell us how well you eventually will sleep and get to sleep. And so sometimes when, and this happens also a lot more so with women, when we go through perimenopause or menopause, is often we'll experience sleep issues. We'll fall asleep okay, but then we'll suddenly wake up 2 or 3 hours later. And so there is a connection with that as well, and cortisol production. And so when we look at the actual test, we can actually see whether your cortisol is low, which should be low at nighttime, or higher, and which could be indicative of perhaps a little too much cortisol at the wrong time of the day, in other words. So those are all actually good reasons why it's important to test for your cortisol levels. It can actually help us as naturopathic doctors to determine what appropriate modifications you need, whether it's perhaps dietary management, food, what you eat and drink actually will play a huge role in cortisol production as well, because cortisol actually affects, and vice versa, it'll affect our insulin production. So our insulin usually goes up when we eat food or drink certain things. And so our insulin essentially gets spit out by our pancreas in order to regulate our blood sugar levels. But those also in turn affect cortisol as well. So, and so sometimes during the night, our insulin will drop. So for example, if our cortisol is too high, it causes our insulin to actually now get pumped out. The insulin will drop, and now sometimes we'll wake up because we're actually hungry. Or we ate, let's say, too many carbohydrates, like grain carbohydrates, like snack food, breads and pastas and things like that. So sometimes it necessitates the need to look at your diet and look at lifestyle changes. So the other component, of course, in why it's important to test and see where you're at with all this is that perhaps some stress modification. In other words, our coping skills. How are we actually managing the stressors that we're dealing with on a daily basis? Are we, shoveling it all down? Are we putting a lid on it? In other words, is there an emotional component that we're just kind of, clamping down, but we're not really taking the time to express in a healthy way? Sometimes a good cry is actually a really great thing because it allows us to kind of open up those channels and release it and not harbor it inside. Those are all just examples of how we can manage the stressors that occur on a daily basis. So those are just a couple of things around adrenals and cortisol. And so I encourage actually all of you to, if this is something that has been on your mind, to actually get tested for, because like I said, the only way that you're really going to accurately know what's really happening with your hormone levels, in this case the stress hormone levels, is to actually run the test and just see where you're at. And then we can appropriately deal with, whatever stage of adrenal stress you're at, and then treat accordingly. So, okay. So that's it for now on adrenals. And so remember, I am Dr. Olena, and I practice out of Parksville, BC. And you can actually, if you have any questions or if you're interested in seeing a naturopathic doctor and you've never seen one, you've always wanted to see one, consider actually just giving me a shout at my office. My number is 778-762-3099. Or you can visit my website at www.indigomedicine.com, and you can read all about me and how I practice and, some of my areas of focus. So that's it for now. Next week, I hope to continue a little bit more on hormones, maybe focusing a little more on female-male hormones and hormone testing. As always, if you have any thoughts on different topics that you would like to see me address, please feel free to actually comment in the Facebook post, because this video, if you're not able to make it live, this video will be posted in a few minutes on my Facebook page, which is also under Indigo Medicine. And do feel free to leave some comments, and yeah, we may actually cover that topic in future videos. And don't hesitate to share this video as well, and to help educate more people out there. So for now, ciao for now. I'm Dr. Olena, and I will see you again hopefully next week. Take care. Have a good, healthy week. Bye now.